Minister, thank you for your time. This budget is framed around cost of living and productivity, and I want to look at it specifically through the lens of women because the data consistently shows that they're experiencing both differently. You have spoken about closing gender gaps across the economy, but women are still spending more time in unpaid care. They're earning less. We're retiring with significantly less super. What's one measurable target in this budget that women can actually track over the next 12 months to know things are improving?
Yeah, so I think, from where I sit, what we've tried to do, and I guess the point is you can't see one budget in isolation of the others. And so in our previous budgets, what we've been trying to do is tackle the big structural drivers of inequality. And they will take time to show benefit. Like we've done the LISTO, the low income super tax offset. Obviously that's going to help women and has been a big issue that the women's sector have been campaigning for. That won't solve things overnight about women's superannuation balances, but it should help over the longer term for younger women coming through the super system. The same with paying super on PPL, for example. Never been done, not going to change things overnight, but over time. And it sends a message that, we respect the role that you're playing as a carer out of the paid workforce. Receiving PPL, you should get an employment entitlement of super on that. The same with women's health, where it's been neglected and underfunded for too long. The changes we put in place in the previous budget, they are just starting to tick up and show and come into this budget, which is the uptake of menopause treatment, the uptake of new contraception. Hugely popular. The pelvic plane and endo clinics all open now, funded in this budget, 33 of them. Again, reaching a group of women who had the system had not been supporting properly. The women's wages, $21 billion into essentially funding the gap of poorly paid care work into reasonably paid care work in aged care and early education and care, flowing through this budget, making a difference. And we're starting to see it in some of the economic indicators. So gender pay gap, the lowest it's been on record. Women earning over $200 more per week than they were earning when we came to government. Participation rates up, more, the workforce stabilised in those care economies. Interestingly, with PPL moving to 6 months, and that happens in this budget too, more men we're seeing than ever before and now taking their share of the PPL because it's a bigger amount of time. And so all of those things, they don't happen in isolation of each other. They're kind of, the budgets speak to each other, and that's part of it. This budget, we're doing some other things on more investments in gender-based violence. The big piece, which is not probably that interesting for a lot of people, but it's really important, is, de-weaponising the systems that we run to keep women safe. I don't think government should lecture others about keeping women safe if some of our systems, and they're big, clunky systems offering support to hundreds of thousands of women, are not right either and doing the right thing. So I kind of see it as like I've come into this job, I've got the portfolio of women and finance, and I've got a list of things I want to get sorted, and each budget I'm crossing them off. And, we've got obviously more things come onto the list as well, but we're making good progress. And over time, it'll make a substantial difference to some of the issues that we saw when we came into government that had been neglected for too long.
Over $4 billion has been committed to ending violence against women since 2022, but services are still reporting that they can't meet demand and that there's a huge crisis in turning women away. Are you satisfied that enough is being done in that area?
I don't think you could, if there was one thing I could solve overnight, even with money, like if you could throw as much money into it and solve it, it would be this area of violence. How do we end violence against women and children? Because it's not only the awful impacts of that violence on those individuals, it's the consequential impacts of health, of economic independence, of housing, of care, all of those are impacted. And it's, I think the single biggest handbrake on women, on actually achieving gender equality in this country, is women's safety. So the short answer is that work is never finished and never complete. We've got to do a second action plan under the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. That work has started and it will inform future budget decision making. But in this budget, I mean, it's an extra couple of $100 million going into that de-weaponising systems work. There's also a couple of $100 million going into the First Nations plan to end violence against women and children in First Nations communities. There's also a reasonably big piece of work that the Assistant Treasurer has been doing around protecting superannuations from perpetrators of violence against women. Again, you don't think you need to do that, but there are people who awful circumstances, and the advocacy network's very strong there. So there's still quite a lot that we're working on, but, yes, of the 500 workers that we funded are ongoing in this budget as well, which are the frontline support to the states and territories. But there's always more to do, and we'll work with the state and territory governments on that as we put together the second action plan, which is due in the next year.
Yeah. When you see the kind of rates of homicide still kind of remaining the same or even climbing in the last couple of years, do you think that it's actually, merely a matter of funding, or is it a matter of approach? Are we approaching this issue in the right way?
I think government's got a responsibility to be, obviously provide investments and policy decisions, make policy decisions, but we can't solve the societal problem of violence against women and children in this country on our own. It's about attitudes, it's about norms, it's about dealing with some of the loud noise we get on social media that's challenging, all the effort that we've all put in over many years. So it's a partnership, and sometimes you despair at the fact that, things don't seem to be improving in the way you want them to, but also a lot of hope, because there's a lot of things governments can do to make women and children safer, and we're working with states and territories on doing that. But yeah, it's a much bigger issue that we need everyone to lean in on.
And I guess that kind of leans into my next point, which is the escalation of the manosphere. What is the government doing to protect younger and indeed older generations outside of the social media ban from manosphere content?
Yeah, well, again, I think, we are thinking about it a lot, about essentially not just the manosphere but the pushback against equality, essentially, that, people kind of even don't like the term gender equality, because it can get translated and mangled into, well, that's women getting more than others, which is not what it's about. It's about the work we're doing is about driving equality across the economy and society. That's what we want. We want everyone to be treated equally. And in those areas of women's safety, the role of care, women's health, leadership and decision making, it is not equal. Governments are doing a lot of thinking about how you manage the pushback. And for me, part of it is just getting on with it, to be honest, like getting on with the changes that I think will make a big difference, and not getting distracted by it. But we have to deal with it as well. And thinking about healthy masculinity and how we talk to young men and deal with the pressure that they are under that this gives them is also an important part of it, because I think, it's not easy for young men either.
Would the federal government consider an idea like the Victorian government's Ministry for Boys and Men?
Well, I think, so in 2025, post the election, the PM appointed Dan Ripper-Coley as the Special Envoy for Men's Health. That was like the first time in the Commonwealth any kind of role has been given there. And I think there is growing acknowledgement that there are areas where it's not right for men either. There's a whole area in men's health where, you know, they don't go to the doctor or they don't follow up, and, you know, trying to reach that group and talk to them is really important. So I think that's an area that's just going to continue to grow.
We're talking a lot about AI productivity as well, and the gains here, but history shows that women often bear the disruption first and benefit last. What specific safeguards or investments are in place to ensure women aren't left behind in that transition?
Yeah. So there's a lot of work underway around that, and obviously everyone's talking about how do you harness the benefits of AI and provide protections, you know, so that, you know, I guess humans don't pay the ultimate price. And so the work that's all of our decisions, all of our thinking, the good thing about the arrangements we've put in is that we have everything go through and take part in gender analysis, so that when we're taking decisions about, you know, regulation of AI or structures about how we deal with it across the economy, that's informed by our gender analysis. So you get that when you're at the decision-making table, thinking specifically about what does this mean for women, and understanding that, you know, in the past, as you say, women often don't come out, you know, in the best, or take, you know, with some of the transition we're seeing with those entry-level jobs where women are more dominant than men, that they would pay the ultimate price. So we're thinking through all of that. We don't have the perfect answer yet, but we will be conscious of it when we're responding to it. And the other thing is also, and we're doing this in climate and energy and technology and science and research, is making sure women get a share of all of that too. Like, we have a highly gender segregated workforce in Australia, and unpicking that, I would prefer in the new industries that we're not unpicking or trying to unpick what we're trying to do in the more traditional industries, which is, you know, seeing that very significant gender segregation, women basically in care, you know, and when it comes to science and technology and engineering and, you know, those jobs, that's predominantly men. And so we're having to come at it from both ways, not only from sort of protect and how do you manage AI as it rolls out and rolls through, but also how do you get a real legitimate, fair opportunity to be in the jobs of the future.
Yeah, because I guess the risk is with the pace of it.
Yeah.
You miss the boat.
Yeah,
Miss the boat.
but we can do things like, you know, with our free TAFE and things like that, making sure that women get a fair shot at that. We're funding, you know, work into gender segregation and how best do you deal with that to encourage women into workplaces that have traditionally been male dominated. So it's like it's a whole of government effort. It involves all ministers, not just the women's minister, to think about these things.
At Women's Agenda with Mecca and Sentiment Agency, we recently brought together more than 30 founders, clinicians, researchers and investors to develop a white paper calling for a moonshot on women's health innovation. If higher CGT makes investors more risk averse, what safeguards are in place to ensure women-led startups in critical areas like health aren't the first to lose out?
So a couple of things there. We've tried to make sure that funding coming through the NH and MRC is actually provided to women scientists and researchers on an equal basis. That was a big change and of course hadn't happened before, and women weren't getting a fair share of that. So we're thinking about it from those points of view. But the budget and the tax reform in this budget also has quite a focus on you know, startups, venture capital, kind of the more newer, more dynamic companies and businesses that are starting up, to make sure that that isn't the case. You know, having to be a little bit more, you know, flexible about what works for companies, because some of the traditional ways we provide incentives won't work in this sector. So we're thinking about all of that, the R&D arrangements to kind of lift the thresholds and focus on core R&D, again, should help that industry. And, you know, it will continue to work with the sector, make sure. On the CGT, I mean, the changes to CGT that we are bringing forward, they, you know, what it's shown when you look at it and the budget takes it through, is they have overcompensated for investments in essentially detached housing. they've undercompensated for shares and, units in particular. So moving to a system that looks at taxing real gains as opposed to, the previous arrangement of 50%, kind of levels the playing field against different types of investment,
I guess when we're talking about, how we generate more revenue within a budget and the constraints that we're up against, as Finance Minister, don't you think that taxing gas exports at 25% makes sense, especially when it's so politically popular?
Yeah, so I've been watching that campaign as well, as you'd expect. So a couple of things on that. One, we've done months and months of work on this, the gas reservation scheme for the country, which is really important because, the domestic gas security has been, underdone in this country, and there were forecasts of gas shortages on the East Coast in particular. So we've done that as part of this budget. And also, and it wasn't here when we started this budget, but it's here now, how we engage with the world when we've got the Middle East conflict and our international partners really around fuel security is really, really important now. I think Jim went to that point earlier, and we've had to make decisions based on that. And, the idea that, we aren't able to secure fuel or would be in a position where we would have less fuel has quite significant and catastrophic impacts on the economy as a whole. And so they're the decisions we've taken, even notwithstanding the fact that, people have some very strong views on this. The budget also has $1.6 billion extra in PRRT, which are reforms that Jim brought in a couple of years ago. I understand the campaign's going to continue, but we think these are the right decisions to take in this budget.
But Minister Gallagher, thank you very much for your time and answering questions. See you next budget.
Yes, no, well, hopefully before. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's really appreciate it.